Hey, in this tutorial you will learn how to use ACEScg in 3ds Max and V-Ray. We will briefly check out what ACES actually is, but then much more important, switch to what would be the basic workflow as an artist to use it correctly, and then check out some issues and how to solve those. Alright, first of all, a little bit of a disclaimer. The topic about ACES in general is quite deep and complex, so I'm by far not a color scientist, and the main purpose of this tutorial is mainly to show you how you as an artist can establish a correct workflow using V-Ray and 3ds Max. So up until recently, V-Ray only supported sRGB color space internally for rendering, but now with the latest version of V-Ray that changed. So now if you go here into settings, color management, you can now find there's an additional option for ACEScg color space. And in this tutorial, I want to talk a little bit about why you should or should not switch to this color space and what would be the workflow in order to use it correctly. Alright, so why should you use sRGB or ACES? So in this picture that I found here on the Chaos Group website, you can see the difference between both of them. So sRGB basically supports a much smaller gamut of colors, and ACEScg is able to support a much wider gamut of colors. So that has historic reasons. So sRGB was introduced in 1996. The idea back then was to create one standard color space for supporting a multitude of different devices. And back then, this smaller gamut didn't really prove to be very limiting because those devices anyway weren't able to capture nor display a wider gamut of colors. But now with ACEScg, it makes it a little bit more future-proof, because then you would also support like much more recent developments in terms of capturing film, in terms of projecting film, in terms of display technologies and so on, because those would be able to capture or display a wider gamut of colors, and that's where ACEScg comes into play. Alright, so does it mean now for V-Ray in every project you should always switch to ACEScg and never use sRGB anymore? In my opinion, that's actually not at all the case. It really depends on your specific situation. So for example, if you work in a team where parts of the team already use ACES, or for example ACES is being used for compositing, color correction and so on, then of course it totally makes sense to switch to ACEScg also for the rendering side. But if that's not really the case, then most likely you would be much better off continue using sRGB, because all your resources and so on probably by default are gonna set up to use with sRGB color space, and to use them within ACES you need to know exactly what you're doing. You need to convert them, because otherwise you run into lots of issues. So that's the point of this tutorial, that I'm gonna show you now how you can use those resources correctly to render a correct image in ACES. So for now we leave everything in sRGB, disable this option down here so that everything is working the way how it was working traditionally in V-Ray versions. And I'll just give you a brief rundown of the scene. We have a ground plane here with a model, and then an HDRI here, which is linked into this dome light. So that's basically the scene. And now we will check on whatever is happening here in the frame buffer. Alright, let's first check this display corrections right here, and that's something that's not really to be confused with these internal color management here, because those are just display corrections. So that means that's something that's happening on top of your rendering, just in this virtual frame buffer. So if you switch it to none, for example, it would switch off those display corrections, and that's something that's basically never really recommended to do unless you have a very specific purpose to do it. You should basically never have those display corrections switched off. Instead, the default choice here is sRGB, which I think is the best choice if you never color calibrated your monitor. That means you just use a monitor that you bought out of the box. It's very likely, or 100% sure, it's a sRGB compatible monitor. So that's basically a default choice if you never really calibrated your monitor. If you calibrated your monitor, for example, to a gamma curve of 2.2, then that's also an interesting option. And you can see both of them are extremely similar. Because sRGB and gamma 2.2, they're very similar in most parts with some tiny differences. And then the next choice here would be OCIO. We're going to talk about this in a second. And then we have ICC. So that's a color profile that basically you would also need a hardware device to generate this color profile specifically for your monitor. So you would need to buy a hardware device and then use a software to calibrate your monitor, and then it would generate this ICC profile in here. And then you can use that specifically for your monitor, which is probably a very good choice. But as said, you need to have a special hardware to do that. And also, it's not enough to just do it once and then use it for 3 years in a row. You should then always keep this up to date every 2 or 3 weeks, generate a new color profile and so on. So as said, if you don't want to mess with like really calibrating your monitor, just stick to sRGB and you probably should be fine to go in most circumstances. So before we check out those options here for OCIO, let's talk a little bit about what it takes in order to make like a photographic looking picture. Just now I disabled the lens effect because we don't need that for now. And if you want to learn more about this, check out my studio lighting tutorial. I go into much more detail in there, but basically we are generating a fully linear image with VRay. And then in order to make it look photographic, in order to make it look realistic, we need to apply some certain kinds of adjustments on top of it in order to make it look more photographic. So if I disable all of this, this one is my fully linear image, of course with the display correction of sRGB. So this is the linear image and it doesn't really look very pleasing to our eyes. So I would need to make it look more photographic, and by this I would basically first of all compress the dynamic range and then add some contrast, and then as a final step use, for example, a lookup table in order to get something that looks more finalized or something that looks more filmic. So these are basically the basic procedures to convert a linear image into something that looks a little bit more photographic. So let's see what happens now if we switch here to ACES. Then we start a new rendering. And then we can immediately see that the colors are changing. That's by itself is nothing either good or bad. It's just that ACES tends to create a little bit more vivid colors. But the other way, or the other reason why those colors change so drastically, is that at the moment we are not using it correctly. Because as soon as we switch here to ACES, it also assumes that all our textures that we have in our scenes are already converted into ACES. And at the moment they are not, because they are converted or they are built in sRGB color space. So that's why we would need to convert those textures first. And you can do that externally or internally. And I will show you later how you do that correctly in VRay. But now let's first talk about this option here of using OCIO display correction. So OCIO stands for OpenColorIO, and it's like a open source configuration file that you can download, install on your computer, and then use in a variety of different software packages. So in this case here, VRay, but you could also use that in Nuke or Houdini or any other kind of software package. So you can download it on opencolorio.org, and then you go here to this downloads folder. And then here you can find these sample configurations, download them and unpack them at a folder on your computer. And then it's important, or it's recommended, to create some environment variable, for example in Windows, so that your software automatically knows where to find these configurations files. Everything that I downloaded, I unzipped now in this folder right here, and now we need to create an environment variable so that our software knows where to find the latest configuration file. So this latest configuration file you can always find with the latest version number right here. And the file we're looking for is this file here, config.ocio. And then we need to create an environment variable under Windows. For other operating systems, you would need to check by yourself. So you just go here in Advanced System Settings, Environment Variables, and then you create a new system variable here, and you call the environment, the variable name is OCIO, and the variable value is basically the file path where you find this latest OCIO file. So it would look like this with the whole file structure right here, and then you create this environment variable, and then VRay would automatically know where to load the latest configuration from. So now back in 3ds Max, we don't need these kind of adjustments that I added here before, because all of those would be now done internally with our OCIO file. So once I now finally switch to this OCIO, it would then load the file from the environment variable that we set before. And then there's different options you can choose here. And I chose, for example, to set the input color space to ACEScg, which kind of makes sense because that's what we're rendering here. And then display device, there's no option right here, but view transformation, you should choose then most likely sRGB, because you're looking at it at a sRGB monitor most likely. So then you can get some photographic final looking result with this kind of configuration. And the advantage is that like this kind of result you would now be able to transfer exactly in any kind of other software package. So you can load the same kind of configuration in Nuke and you will get like a very consistent exactly same result like here in VRay. But the disadvantage is that you now don't have these sub controls here anymore about exactly what's happening here internally. It's basically just all handled now from this OCIO file right here now. But if you work with ACEScg, this is a very good option that you should basically consider to use. Alright, so now that we switch to ACEScg and that we use this OCIO display correction here, which by the way is not a requirement to use for ACEScg, it's just recommended or it just makes sense, but you could also just keep on working like this, for example, is also no problem at all. But now we're gonna continue this OCIO here. And then the next step that we have to take care of is the texture, because as soon as this one here is switched to ACEScg, VRay will assume that all the textures that you load into your scene are also already converted into ACEScg color space, and most likely they are not. So for example, if we open here our material editor, these ones here are the resources that I use in this scene now. We just have this VRay color that I use for the shader in here, and then I have this VRayBitmap which I use for the environment and for the VRay light. So let's take care about our diffuse component or our VRay color in here first. And in order to do that, I will just quickly disable the reflection in here so that we only take care about our diffuse color. And now once we switch to our diffuse color in here, we will see that for VRay color, there's now this additional option right here for VRay 5 for choosing the RGB primary. So there's 3 different options: none, that's the default option, sRGB and ACEScg. And there you can define like those values that you set up in here from which color space do they actually derive from. So at the moment it's set to none, and that means it will just check whatever color space you set up in here and then take those values from there basically. Then you can force them to be used in sRGB color space. So then you have those values right here, but they are coming from sRGB color space, but you are rendering in ACEScg. And then you can also just confirm again that those numbers here are in ACEScg color space. And this you can quickly check by just, for example, going to your diffuse channel right here, and those are the values, so 0.75, 0.5 and 0.1. And if you can see the color picker down here, so if I then choose the values here of my diffuse channel, then I can see that those values are exactly right. But now if I switch to sRGB, then even those values here are set up like this. They are not rendered like this because those values come from sRGB color space, but in ACEScg, those color values would be translated in those color values here, right in here. So, and then if you go to none, we just double confirm that basically now it uses ACEScg color space because that's what we set up in here. But in our case, let's just make sure to switch here to ACEScg and then we can move on. Alright, so now let's just add back the reflection color in here again, and then let's take care about our VRayBitmap. So let me first show you how stuff was done traditionally in VRay. So there's this node here called VRayOCIO, and if you use this, you can manually convert, for example, here bitmaps in the correct color space that you need. So let me just copy this VRayBitmap in here and then map that into in here. And because we set up this environment variable, basically everything is already loaded. So we then define our input color space and our output color space. So our output color space, of course, should be ACEScg. And then our input, we will need to choose whatever color space this one here is using. So in this case, for example, it is a linear sRGB texture. So you can choose this one right here. And then you will see if I open this this color preview here, or this preview here, then you will see that the colors, they changed a little bit, right? So here it's more saturated, and in ACEScg color space, those colors are a little bit more desaturated. So now our HDRI that before was in sRGB color space is now converted correctly to ACES color space, or ACEScg. And then now if we connect this to our light and to our environment, then we will see that now the colors are not this crazy oversaturated anymore, and they now look much more natural and much more how this HDRI is supposed to be used. So these kinds of steps you had to do for each and every single of your textures. So what, for example, you want to choose a different diffuse color. So let's choose another VRayBitmap in here, and then for example choose this JPEG texture here, which is this green texture. I will just connect it in here. So now those, oops, what happened here? So now those colors would be wrong again, because this texture is also encoded in sRGB color space, so they are also overly saturated again. So now we would need to connect them again through this VRayOCIO. So let's just connect this again, and then in here, and then because this one here was a HDRI, so a linear texture, and then this one would be not a linear texture but a sRGB texture. And then once we do that, then the colors get really crazy. And now there's another inconvenience, for example, that because if you go check your preferences, your 3ds Max most likely is set up like this, that every texture it loads already gets this gamma curve applied to it. So then you would need to change it in here, or you need to go back in here and then choose this color space transfer function to none. And now you would have the original correct color. So you can see there's a lot of mistakes that you can do. And now luckily in the latest version of VRay, there is easier steps to facilitate these kind of process. So instead of going through this complicated way here with these VRayOCIO nodes, let's just go back to what we had before. And then I will show you which way or what solution have been done in order to make this process much easier. So let me just connect this again here and then delete these OCIO nodes. And now we're basically using the wrong color space again. So inside the VRayBitmap, there's also the option to define in what color space those textures here actually are. So for example, in this VRayBitmap for my HDRI, I would then define that this one here, so if it's set to default, then it will assume that whatever color space you set up in your render settings is basically already the color space also of the bitmap. But in this case, for example, this one is an sRGB color space, and you can see also once we go closely to here, so as soon this one here is default, now it assumes it's already encoded in ACEScg, but if I switch this one here to sRGB, then we will get exactly the same result like before with the VRayOCIO node, and the same for this one here as well. So this one you would also switch to sRGB, and then now this process is just much more easier than before. So there's an even easier way, which I'm going to show you now, and that is this one here. So if you go in render settings, then there's this additional option here, auto RGB primaries for VRayBitmap texture. And this one requires you to rename your textures with specific name tags, and then those textures would be loaded already correctly. So those two textures here were my original textures, and then I basically just duplicated them and gave them these additional name tags. So for example, for my HDRI, it has this _lin for linear _sRGB name tag, and you can put this wherever you want in the name. And then for my JPEG texture right here, I just added this _sRGB name tag. And then once you load in a new VRayBitmap in your scene, and then let me just load, for example, the HDRI here. Then let me just switch this one here to the correct settings. Then you can see, because if I switch on this option, so now the option is off. If I switch on the option, then the switch on the option, then it will determine by the name tag like which are the correct settings here for this bitmap right here. So you can see on and off, and if it's off, then it ignores whatever name tag you have and it just chooses like whatever you set up in here. But if you use this one, then it will override it and basically use whatever name tag you defined in here. So now let's double confirm that with our diffuse map here. So I will open another VRayBitmap and then load the diffuse map, and you can see the colors are also matching from those ones here. And now we can exchange the diffuse map here and then the HDRI here to the name tagged ones and get rid of those two here, because this kind of setup has one major advantage that I'm going to show you now. So remember, we are here in this ACEScg color space, and now let's switch here to the sRGB display correction. Now it's the linear image again, but so remember how this one looks like. And then once I switch to the sRGB ones, you can see now they both look identical or pretty much the same, because now automatically those textures are loaded the correct way. So if I use sRGB here, then it wouldn't get these additional transformations on the color space applied to, and if I choose to ACEScg color space, then it would make these switches. And you can also see that if I turn off the rendering. So if I switch here to ACEScg, you will see the colors are changing, and if I switch to sRGB, the colors are changing again. So that's basically the best kind of setup, because like this way you just need to one time rename your textures in your texture library, and then no matter which color space you end up rendering in, everything will always be loaded correctly. Alright, so that concludes the tutorial about how to use ACEScg workspace in VRay in a nutshell. I hope you found this content useful. If you did, you might be also interested in the other tutorials that I published in my YouTube channel, and you might also be interested in visiting my Patreon, where you can find lots of additional resources regarding all my tutorials and lots of additional information. So I hope to see you soon, and take care.